The night my mother died, I expected silence, I expected respect, I expected at least one moment of human decency. Instead, my husband laughed, and in that laugh something inside me broke forever. People think betrayal always comes dressed as anger or violence, but sometimes it comes smiling, sometimes it comes joking, sometimes it sounds like laughter at the exact moment your heart is already bleeding. This is not just a story about a cruel husband. This is a story about dignity, about truth, and about the unexpected moment when the loudest voice in the room was not mine. It was his boss, and that moment changed everything. The day my mother died, I learned that grief is not just about loss, it is about revelation, because pain does not knock politely, it opens doors you did not know were locked, and it shows you who is willing to stand with you when everything feels like it is falling apart, and who would rather turn your sorrow into background noise or worse, into a joke. I remember sitting there holding my phone, staring at the screen after the call ended, feeling like my chest had collapsed inward, like the air had been pulled out of the room, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding louder than my thoughts. My hands were shaking, not because I was weak, but because love does that to you when it is suddenly torn away without warning. I looked at my husband, hoping for comfort, hoping for quiet, hoping for some sign that I was not alone in this moment, but instead of compassion I was met with laughter, not nervous, not accidental, but careless and cruel laughter, followed by words that minimized my pain, as if my mother was just another story on the news, as if the woman who carried me, who prayed over me, who sacrificed for me was just an inconvenience to his day. And in that moment something inside me hardened, not out of bitterness but out of clarity, because grief has a way of sharpening your vision when everything else becomes blurry. I realized then that people do not always show you their true selves in moments of joy, because happiness is easy to share, but sorrow demands something deeper. It demands empathy, patience, and respect, and not everyone is willing to give that, even to the person they claim to love the most. When someone laughs at your grief, they are telling you without saying it that your pain does not matter to them, that your heart is not a place they feel responsible for protecting, and that realization hurts in a way that goes beyond the loss itself, because you are grieving twice, once for the person you lost and once for the safety you thought you had in your relationship. I remember thinking, how can someone who sleeps beside me every night fail to recognize the magnitude of this moment? How can someone hear about the death of my mother and respond with humor and indifference? And the answer was simple and devastating, because he had never truly valued what mattered to me. Grief strips away the masks people wear. It exposes their priorities, their character, and their capacity for compassion. And that day I saw clearly that my husband had a limited emotional range when it came to anyone else's pain, especially mine. He was uncomfortable with vulnerability, impatient with sorrow, and unwilling to slow down for something that did not directly affect him. And that is a dangerous combination, because love requires the ability to sit with discomfort, to hold space for pain even when you cannot fix it. Laughing at someone's loss is not just insensitive, it is a declaration that you do not take their emotional world seriously, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it. I sat there quietly, not because I accepted his behavior, but because my spirit was busy processing a truth that had just been revealed to me, that I had been emotionally alone in ways I did not fully acknowledge. Before, I thought about all the times I had minimized my own feelings to keep the peace, all the moments I swallowed my hurt so I would not be labeled dramatic or difficult, and suddenly it all connected. This was not an isolated incident, it was a pattern coming into focus. Grief did not create this cruelty, it uncovered it, and that is why grief is such a powerful teacher. It does not lie, it does not soften the truth, it places it right in front of you and asks you what you are going to do with it. As I mourned my mother, I also mourned the illusion of who I thought my husband was. I realized that love without empathy is not love, it is convenience, and partnership without respect is not a partnership, it is a performance. People often say you find out who someone really is when things get hard, and that day was proof, because instead of stepping up, he stepped away emotionally, and instead of offering support, he offered dismissal and laughter, which is one of the most painful forms of disrespect, because it mocks your vulnerability and makes you feel small at the exact moment you need to be held gently. I did not argue with him that day. I did not have the energy to educate a grown man on basic human decency. My grief was sacred, and I refused to let his insensitivity contaminate it, so I withdrew into myself and began observing not just his words but his actions and his reactions to my sorrow. I noticed how quickly he wanted me to move on, how irritated he became when I cried, how he avoided conversations about my mother as if her memory was an inconvenience, and that observation taught me something critical about emotional safety, that it is not guaranteed by marriage or proximity, it is earned through consistent care and respect. Grief also taught me that you cannot force someone to care, you cannot beg someone to understand the depth of your pain, and you should not have to explain why your mother's death matters. If someone lacks empathy, that is not a misunderstanding, it is a character flaw, and acknowledging that truth is painful but necessary, because staying blind to it only prolongs your suffering. I realized that day that my healing would require me to stop expecting compassion from someone who had already shown me they were unwilling to give it, and that realization, while heartbreaking, was also empowering because it freed me from waiting for something that was never going to come. In the quiet moments after that, laughter echoed in my mind, not because it hurt but because it clarified. It became a marker, a dividing line between before and after. Before, I made excuses for his behavior, and after, I began seeing it for what it truly was, a lack of respect for my humanity. Grief has a way of recalibrating your tolerance for nonsense. When you lose someone you love deeply, you realize how precious emotional safety is and how quickly life can change, and you stop entertaining behavior that drains your spirit instead of nourishing it. I thought about my mother and how she would have responded to that moment. She would have stood tall, she would have reminded me of my worth, and she would have told me that anyone who laughs at your pain does not deserve access to your heart. And in my sorrow, her wisdom found its way back to me, guiding me even in her absence, and I understood then that her death, while devastating, had also given me a final lesson about self-respect and discernment. She showed me that love should feel safe, especially in moments of loss, and that anything less is not love at all. Grief reveals who people really are because it demands authenticity. There is no room for performance. When someone is hurting deeply, you either show up with compassion or you expose your indifference, and my husband exposed his that day, not with anger or cruelty alone but with laughter that dismissed my pain and minimized my loss. And while that laughter broke something in me, it also built something new, a resolve to honor my feelings, to trust what I saw, and to stop excusing behavior that harmed me emotionally, because grief may break your heart but it also opens your eyes, and once they are open you cannot pretend not to see the truth standing right in front of you. Disrespect does not always announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in humor, sarcasm, and casual remarks that are easy to dismiss if you are not paying attention, and that is what makes it so dangerous, because it trains you to doubt your own feelings. It makes you question whether you are being too sensitive, whether you misunderstood the tone, whether you should just let it go, and over time that quiet disrespect erodes your sense of worth more deeply than open anger ever could, because anger is obvious and confrontational, but disrespect is subtle and persistent. It seeps into the cracks of your daily life and settles there until you begin to normalize it. I began to understand this after my mother died, and my husband laughed because that laughter was not just a moment, it was a message. It said my pain is not important enough to slow him down. It said my grief is an inconvenience rather than a sacred experience, and it said that my emotions exist on a lower level than his comfort and his mood. And when disrespect shows up like that, it does not look dramatic enough to call out immediately, but it leaves a heavy residue on your spirit that you cannot ignore no matter how hard you try. Disrespect hides behind jokes because jokes provide cover. If you react, you are told you cannot take a joke. If you stay quiet, the behavior continues and grows bolder. This is how people learn what they can get away with, and laughter at someone's pain is one of the clearest forms of this dynamic, because it places the burden on the grieving person to either absorb the insult or risk being labeled difficult or overly emotional, and that is a cruel position to put anyone in, especially someone who is already hurting. I noticed how often disrespect appeared in small ways long before that day, but grief sharpened my awareness. There were the eye rolls when I talked about things that mattered to me, the sighs when I needed emotional support, the quick subject changes when conversations got too heavy for his liking, and I had excused all of it as stress or personality differences, because that is what we are taught to do. Especially as women, we are taught to be understanding, accommodating, and patient even when patience costs us our peace. But disrespect does not disappear when you excuse it, it grows stronger because it learns that there are no consequences. The laugh at my mother's death was not an isolated incident, it was the loudest example of a pattern that had been whispering for years, and once I saw it clearly I could not unsee it. I realized that anger would have at least acknowledged the seriousness of the moment, but laughter dismissed it entirely. It reduced my grief to something trivial, something unworthy of compassion, and that kind of dismissal cuts deeply because it denies your reality, and when someone denies your reality, they are telling you that your inner world does not matter to them. Disrespect is louder than anger because anger can be followed by remorse, apologies and change, but disrespect rarely is because it stems from a belief that the other person is less deserving of care, and that belief does not shift easily when someone sees you as less than. Your pain becomes optional to acknowledge and your boundaries become suggestions rather than requirements, and living in that dynamic slowly teaches you to shrink yourself to avoid being hurt again. You stop sharing. You stop asking, and you stop expecting anything more than the bare minimum. I found myself becoming quieter, not because I had nothing to say but because I was tired of being dismissed. I learned to read his moods, to time my emotions, to choose my words carefully so they would not be met with sarcasm or indifference, and that is when I understood how damaging disrespect can be, because it forces you to self-edit in spaces where you should feel safe, and that constant self-monitoring is exhausting. It drains your energy and chips away at your sense of self until you barely recognize the person you have become. The laughter was a breaking point because it crossed a line that should never be crossed. It violated a basic human expectation that grief deserves reverence and silence, not mockery, and in that moment I felt something shift inside me, not anger but clarity. I realized that I had been trying to earn respect from someone who did not see the need to give it freely, and respect that must be begged for is not respect at all. It is control disguised as tolerance. I thought about how often people confuse love with endurance, how we are praised for staying, for being strong, for putting up with things that hurt us, and how rarely we are encouraged to demand respect without apology. But respect is not a luxury, it is a requirement for any healthy relationship, and without it love becomes hollow, words become empty, and commitment becomes a cage rather than a choice. Disrespect also isolates you because it makes you feel alone even when you are not physically alone. I was sitting next to my husband when he laughed, yet I had never felt more solitary because the person who was supposed to be my partner had emotionally stepped away from me, and that kind of loneliness is profound. It makes you feel unseen, unheard, and unprotected, and over time it can convince you that this is all you deserve if you are not careful. Grief removed the fog for me. It made it impossible to continue ignoring the signs because the stakes were too high. My mother's death reminded me that life is fragile and that time is precious, and that spending it with someone who treats your pain lightly is a cost too great to pay. I realized that anger would have at least meant he cared enough to react, but disrespect meant he did not care at all, and that realization was painful but necessary. I began to understand that disrespect is not something you can argue away or fix with better communication, because it is rooted in how someone sees you, and changing that requires willingness and self-reflection on their part, not just patience on yours. And I could not do that work for him no matter how much I loved him or wanted the relationship to survive. That laughter became a symbol of everything I had been ignoring and minimizing, and it forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding, that I had been accepting crumbs of consideration in a space where I deserved a full seat at the table. And once you recognize disrespect for what it is, you cannot go back to pretending it is harmless because your spirit knows better. Disrespect is louder than anger because it speaks even when no words are spoken. It shows up in the absence of care, the lack of concern, and the ease with which someone dismisses what matters to you. And when you finally listen to that message, it changes you. It teaches you to value yourself more fiercely, to protect your heart more intentionally, and to stop explaining why you deserve to be treated with basic human decency. In the end, I learned that love should never require you to tolerate disrespect, and grief should never be met with laughter, and anyone who cannot honor your pain is not someone you should trust with your heart, because respect is the foundation of every meaningful connection, and without it, everything else eventually falls apart. Silence is often misunderstood. People think if you are not speaking, you are surrendering; if you are not arguing, you are agreeing; and if you are not reacting, you are weak. But silence can be one of the most powerful responses a person can choose, especially when emotions are high and the truth is unfolding in front of you, because silence creates space to observe, to understand, and to see clearly without the distortion of immediate reaction. And that is what happened to me in the days after my husband laughed at my grief. I did not go quiet because I had nothing to say. I went quiet because I had too much to process, and I needed to hear what was being revealed without interrupting it with excuses or explanations. In that silence I was listening not just to his words but to the absence of care in his tone, to the impatience in his body language, to the way he avoided my eyes when my mother's name was mentioned, and how quickly he changed the subject when the room grew heavy. I noticed how he expected me to recover on his timeline, how discomfort made him restless, and how he seemed more concerned with restoring normalcy than honoring loss. And silence allowed me to register all of this without the distraction of confrontation, because when you confront too quickly, you sometimes give people the opportunity to perform remorse without actually feeling it. I realized that silence is not emptiness, it is information gathering. It is the moment you stop filling the space with hope and start filling it with truth. When I stopped explaining my feelings and stopped asking for understanding, I saw clearly what was being offered to me and what was not, and what I saw was a pattern of emotional avoidance that had been present long before my mother died, but had never been so obvious because I had always softened it with patience and rationalization. Silence stripped those justifications away and left only reality. There is a kind of silence that is born from fear, and there is a kind of silence that is born from strength. Mine came from strength because I refused to beg for empathy or teach compassion to someone who had already shown me they were unwilling to give it. I needed to see whether he would step forward on his own, whether he would recognize the depth of my pain without being prompted, and whether he would take responsibility for the harm his laughter caused. And in the quiet that followed, his choices spoke louder than any argument ever could. Silence also protected me because in moments of deep grief, words can become weapons turned inward. You can say things you are not ready to unpack or forgive, and I was not interested in escalating pain. I was interested in understanding it, and that required restraint and patience, not submission. Silence gave me time to mourn my mother without entangling my grief in a cycle of conflict that would have drained me further. It allowed me to keep my sorrow sacred and separate from his inability to meet me emotionally. As the days passed, I noticed how uncomfortable my silence made him, because people who are used to being explained to often panic when explanations stop. They rely on your words to soften their behavior, to make it easier to ignore the impact of their actions. When I stopped talking, he lost that cushion, and what emerged was defensiveness, impatience, and irritation, which only confirmed what my silence had already revealed, that he was more bothered by my quiet withdrawal than by the pain that caused it. Observation is a form of self-respect. It is choosing to understand before deciding to respond, and in my silence I was observing not just him but myself. I noticed how my body reacted around him, how my shoulders tensed, how my breath shortened, how I felt the need to brace myself emotionally, and those physical signals told me what my mind had been reluctant to admit, that I no longer felt safe expressing vulnerability in his presence. And emotional safety is not optional, it is essential, especially during grief. Silence gave me clarity because it slowed everything down. It allowed me to see the difference between words and actions, between promises and behavior, and between what I wanted to believe and what was actually happening. I realized that every time I had spoken up in the past, he had minimized, deflected, or dismissed my concerns, and that speaking louder or more often had never produced lasting change. It had only exhausted me and trained him to wait out my emotions until I settled down, and silence broke that cycle. There is power in not reacting immediately, because reaction is often driven by emotion while response is driven by understanding, and I needed understanding more than I needed release. I needed to know whether this moment would lead to accountability or avoidance, whether it would inspire growth or reveal stagnation, and the quiet answered those questions without me having to ask them directly, because people reveal their intentions through what they do when they think no one is watching, and silence makes them think you are not watching when in fact you are seeing everything. I also learned that silence can be an act of self-preservation. When your heart is raw and your spirit is tender, you must choose carefully where to spend your energy, and I chose not to spend mine trying to convince someone to care. I spent it honoring my mother's memory, tending to my own grief, and rebuilding the parts of myself that had been shaken by both loss and betrayal. Silence was the boundary I set to protect my healing process from further harm. In that quiet space I began to ask myself hard questions, not about him but about me, about why I had accepted less than I deserved, about why I had mistaken endurance for love, and about why I had been afraid to trust my own perceptions. Those questions were uncomfortable but necessary, and they led me to a deeper understanding of my worth and my needs, and that understanding would not have been possible if I had filled the space with noise. Silence also taught me patience with myself. It reminded me that I did not have to have all the answers immediately, that I was allowed to take time to feel, to think, and to decide what came next. Grief does not operate on a schedule, and neither does clarity, and giving myself permission to be quiet gave both the room they needed to unfold naturally. As time passed, my silence became a mirror reflecting his behavior back to him without commentary, and what he saw he did not like, but it was not my responsibility to make it more comfortable for him. Discomfort is often the beginning of awareness, and if he was ever going to understand the impact of his actions, he needed to sit with that discomfort without my constant mediation. In the end, silence showed me that strength does not always look like speaking up. Sometimes it looks like stepping back and allowing the truth to reveal itself without interference. My quiet was not surrender, it was strategy, it was respect for my own process, and it was the moment I stopped trying to manage someone else's response and started paying attention to what their behavior was telling me, because when you listen carefully in silence, people always tell you exactly who they are. Truth has a way of traveling on its own timetable and finding the ears that are ready to hear it even when you are not actively looking for validation or rescue, because when something is real it carries weight, and that weight eventually settles somewhere visible, and that is what happened to me. I was not seeking an audience, I was not planning a confrontation, and I was not trying to expose my husband. I was simply existing inside my grief, doing my best to hold myself together one breath at a time, and yet the truth followed me into that room quietly, confidently, waiting for the right moment to stand up on its own. We were surrounded by people, conversations overlapping, laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of normal life continuing the way it always does, even when your personal world has cracked open. And I remember feeling invisible in that space, because grief makes you feel separate, like you are watching life through a pane of glass while everyone else moves freely on the other side. I did not want attention, I did not want sympathy, I wanted to get through the evening without falling apart, and I believed if I stayed quiet I could manage that, because silence had become my armor. Someone asked a simple question about why I had been away, why I seemed distant, and before I could gather my thoughts, before I could decide how much truth I could afford to share, my husband laughed again, that same careless sound that carried no awareness of consequence, no recognition of harm. And in that moment I felt exposed, not because of what he said but because of what he revealed about himself in front of people who did not share his indifference. And sometimes the truth does not need embellishment, it only needs an audience that understands basic humanity. What happened next was not loud or dramatic. There was no shouting, no spectacle, no grand speech, just a calm, steady voice cutting through the noise with a kind of authority that does not need to raise itself to be heard. His boss spoke not as a superior asserting power but as a human being responding to cruelty, and he said he had lost his own mother, and that there are losses that permanently change the shape of your life, and that grief is not something to joke about and respect is not optional. And when he said it, the room shifted, because people felt the truth of it instantly. That moment mattered, not because someone defended me but because someone named what was happening without apology or hesitation. And when truth is spoken clearly, it has a way of silencing excuses. It leaves no room for misunderstanding and no shelter for denial. I watched my husband's face change as the weight of those words landed, and for the first time I saw him confronted, not by me, not by emotion, not by tears, but by a standard of decency he could not argue against. And that is when I understood how powerful truth becomes when it is no longer carried alone. I did not speak during that exchange. I did not need to, because the truth had already stepped forward on my behalf, and there was relief in that, a deep, quiet relief that came from realizing I was not imagining things, I was not exaggerating, and I was not being too sensitive. The behavior that had wounded me was objectively wrong, and hearing it acknowledged by someone outside the marriage broke the isolation I had been carrying inside myself, because isolation thrives in secrecy and confusion, but truth dissolves both. Sometimes the hardest part of enduring disrespect is the fear that no one else would see it, that if you spoke up you would be doubted, minimized, or told to handle it privately. But that moment taught me that truth does not always need your voice to be validated. It can stand on its own when the conditions are right, and when someone with integrity recognizes it and chooses to speak it aloud, the impact is profound, because it confirms what you have known deep down but may have been afraid to trust. What struck me most was not the words themselves but the ease with which they were spoken. There was no hesitation, no nervous laughter, no attempt to soften the message. It was delivered calmly, as if stating something obvious, and that simplicity made it undeniable, because cruelty does not survive well in the presence of calm moral clarity. It relies on chaos, confusion, and silence to continue, and when someone introduces clarity the entire dynamic shifts. In that moment I realized how much energy I had spent managing my husband's behavior, cushioning his reactions, and translating my pain into language he might accept. And here was someone who did none of that, someone who simply stated the truth and moved on. And it showed me how unnecessary my constant self-editing had been, because respect does not require negotiation when it is understood as a baseline value. The room returned to its conversation slowly, but something had changed for me internally because I had witnessed the truth being spoken without consequence, without retaliation, and without collapse, and it gave me a new perspective on my own silence. I saw that silence does not mean the truth disappears, it means it waits, and sometimes it waits for someone else to recognize it and say it out loud, and that does not diminish your strength, it reinforces it, because truth is not owned by one voice, it belongs to reality itself. I did not feel triumphant, I did not feel vindicated, I felt grounded because that moment anchored me in reality. It reminded me that what I experienced was real and that my expectations for basic respect were not unreasonable. They were shared by others who had no emotional investment in defending or dismissing my pain, and that shared recognition lifted a weight I had been carrying quietly. There is something deeply affirming about hearing your unspoken truth reflected back to you by someone else, especially when you have been doubting yourself for so long. It is like a mirror clearing after being fogged for years, and suddenly you see clearly again, and with that clarity comes choice, because once the truth is visible you must decide what you are willing to accept and what you are no longer willing to carry. That moment did not fix my marriage, it did not erase my grief, and it did not provide a neat resolution, but it gave me something more valuable. It gave me confirmation, and confirmation is powerful because it replaces confusion with certainty, and certainty is the foundation of change. I no longer needed to wonder whether I was overreacting or misinterpreting, because the truth had been spoken plainly in a space where it could not be dismissed. I learned then that truth does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires patience and presence and the courage to allow reality to unfold without interference, because when you stop protecting someone from the consequences of their behavior, you allow the truth to reach places your voice alone might never reach, and that is not weakness, it is wisdom. As we left that gathering I felt different, not lighter but steadier, like something inside me had clicked into place. I understood that my experience mattered beyond the confines of my own perception, and that I did not need to shout to be heard. I only needed to trust that truth has its own momentum and its own allies, and when the time is right it will speak through the mouths of those who recognize it, and when it does you will know that you were never wrong for feeling what you felt. You were simply ahead of the moment when the truth decided to show itself fully. Public truth carries a kind of power that private pain never can, because pain kept inside tends to fold in on itself, while truth spoken in the open expands. It reaches corners you could never reach alone, and it changes the balance of what is acceptable and what is no longer hidden. And that is what happened to me after that moment when his boss spoke up. It was not about embarrassment or humiliation, it was about exposure, the kind that brings clarity, not chaos, because once something is named publicly it loses the ability to quietly harm you in the dark. For a long time I had been carrying the weight of my husband's behavior in silence, believing that protecting the image of our marriage was part of being loyal and strong, and I told myself that what happened between us should stay between us and that real women handle things privately. But what I did not realize then was that my silence was not protecting love, it was protecting disrespect, and the moment the truth was spoken out loud by someone else, the burden shifted off my shoulders and onto the behavior where it belonged. I noticed the immediate change in energy after those words were spoken. There was no drama, no gossip, no sides taken, but there was a subtle recalibration of what people understood to be acceptable and unacceptable, and that mattered because public truth does not require everyone to judge, it only requires enough people to recognize it, and that recognition changes how you see yourself in the situation. I no longer felt like the only one carrying the moral weight of what had happened. It was no longer my private shame to manage. What surprised me most was the quiet strength I felt afterward, not loud confidence, not anger, but steadiness, because when the truth is acknowledged openly it validates your internal experience in a way that nothing else can. It tells you that your feelings are grounded in reality, not imagination, and that validation restores something important, your trust in yourself. I had spent so much time questioning my reactions, wondering if I was too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, and hearing the truth affirmed publicly dissolved those doubts almost instantly. Public truth also removed the pressure to explain myself. I did not need to recount details or justify my hurt because the core issue had already been named. Grief deserves respect, and mocking it is wrong. That simple statement carried more weight than any emotional explanation I could have offered, and it reminded me that sometimes the most powerful truths are the simplest ones, the ones that cut through complexity and land directly on what matters. I realized then how isolating private suffering can be, especially when it is tied to someone you are expected to defend. The unspoken rule is that you present a united front no matter what, and that rule can trap you in a cycle of silence where your pain has no witness, and without a witness pain can begin to feel unreal, like something you imagined or exaggerated, and public truth breaks that spell. It creates a witness, and with a witness comes accountability. Accountability does not always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like awareness, and awareness is the first step toward change or clarity. Either the behavior changes or your understanding of the relationship does, but either way you are no longer stuck in uncertainty. After that moment I did not have to wonder whether his behavior was acceptable, because the standard had been clearly stated, and once a standard is visible you can measure everything against it without confusion. I also saw how public truth shifts dynamics within a relationship. When disrespect is hidden, it thrives. When it is exposed, it loses power because it can no longer be disguised as misunderstanding or humor. My husband could no longer laugh it off or minimize it as my overreaction, because it had been identified by someone outside our emotional bubble, and that external recognition changed the rules even if nothing else changed immediately. There is a deep relief that comes from no longer carrying the secret of your own hurt. Relief does not mean joy, it means release, and that release creates space for healing because you are no longer expending energy keeping something contained that wants to be acknowledged. I felt that release in small ways, in how I breathed more deeply, how my shoulders relaxed, how I stopped replaying the moment in my mind trying to decide if I had imagined its cruelty. Public truth also taught me that protecting someone's reputation at the cost of your well-being is not loyalty, it is self-abandonment, and that lesson was hard but necessary because I had been taught that endurance was virtuous and that speaking up was betrayal. But the truth is that betrayal happens when you are hurt and expected to stay silent about it, because silence teaches others that your pain is negotiable and your boundaries are optional. I began to understand that truth spoken openly does not have to be cruel. It can be calm, measured, and respectful and still be powerful. The way it was that night, there was no malice in the words, only clarity, and that clarity was enough to disrupt a pattern that had relied on ambiguity to survive. And I learned that you do not need to raise your voice to be heard when the truth is on your side. Another shift I felt was in how I viewed myself. I no longer saw myself as someone who had failed to manage her marriage properly. I saw myself as someone who had endured disrespect longer than she should have, and that reframing mattered because it replaced shame with compassion, and self-compassion is essential for healing. It allows you to see your past choices as survival strategies rather than weaknesses. Public truth also freed me from the urge to convince anyone of my worth, because worth does not need defending. When it is recognized, it stands on its own, and once I felt that recognition, I stopped trying to prove that my grief mattered. I allowed it to simply exist without apology, and that freedom was transformative because it returned my energy to me. I realized that truth has a ripple effect. Once it is spoken, it continues to influence even in silence afterward. It changes how conversations feel, how glances land, how behavior is interpreted, and even if no one mentions it again, it has already done its work because it has redefined the moral landscape, and that redefinition lingers. That moment also clarified something important about timing. There are times when you speak and times when you let the truth speak through circumstance, and I had needed that moment to arrive naturally, because if I had forced it, it might have been dismissed as emotional or reactive, but arriving on its own, it carried an authority that could not be questioned, and that taught me the value of patience and trust in the process of revelation. In the days that followed, I felt less compelled to justify my decisions or explain my emotional distance, because the truth had already created context people understood without needing details, and that understanding gave me space to focus on what mattered: my healing, my boundaries, and my next steps. Public truth carries private power because it restores balance. It moves the weight of responsibility from the wounded to the behavior that caused the wound, and that shift is essential for reclaiming your sense of agency, because once you are no longer busy managing the narrative, you can begin managing your life with intention and clarity. In the end, that moment was not about someone else speaking for me, it was about the truth being acknowledged beyond my inner world, and that acknowledgement gave me permission to stop doubting myself, stop minimizing my pain, and stop carrying what was never mine to hold. And that is the quiet but profound power of public truth. It does not shout, it does not shame, it simply stands there undeniable, and in doing so it gives you back your footing and your voice even if you never say another word. Healing does not arrive all at once, and it does not come with a dramatic announcement. It begins quietly in the moment you decide that your pain deserves care and your life deserves honesty. And that moment for me came not when everything was resolved, but when I stopped waiting for someone else to change and started listening to what my own spirit had been asking for all along. Because healing is not about fixing what is broken in someone else, it is about tending to what has been wounded within you and choosing yourself even when it feels unfamiliar or uncomfortable. After everything that had happened, after the laughter, after the silence, after the truth was spoken publicly, I realized that I could not go back to the version of myself who minimized her needs to keep the peace. Something fundamental had shifted, and that shift demanded action, not dramatic gestures but consistent choices that honored my emotional safety. I began by allowing myself to feel without rushing the process. I let grief move through me in its own time without apologizing for it, and that alone was a radical act because I had spent years editing my emotions for someone else's comfort. Choosing myself meant redefining strength for myself. It meant understanding that strength is not endurance at all costs. It is discernment. It is knowing when to stay and when to step back, and it is having the courage to admit when something is harming you even if you once loved it deeply. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could tolerate and started measuring it by how well I could care for myself, and that change reshaped everything from how I spoke to myself to how I allowed others to treat me. Healing required me to release the hope that the past could be rewritten, because hope can sometimes tether you to situations that no longer serve you. I had hope that if I explained myself better, if I was more patient, if I waited long enough, something would shift. But healing asked me to let go of that fantasy and face the present honestly, to see what was in front of me, not what I wished it could be. And that honesty was painful but freeing because it grounded me in reality rather than possibility. I began setting boundaries not as punishments but as protections. Boundaries are often misunderstood as walls, but they are actually doors with clear rules about who may enter and how, and for the first time I gave myself permission to close those doors when they were repeatedly crossed. I stopped engaging in conversations that dismissed my feelings. I stopped laughing along to ease discomfort, and I stopped explaining why respect mattered, because my healing did not require anyone else's approval. There was guilt in choosing myself, because when you have been conditioned to prioritize others, your self-care can feel selfish. At first I felt that guilt deeply, but I learned to sit with it rather than obey it. Guilt is not always a sign that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that you are doing something new and unfamiliar, and as I continued to choose myself, that guilt softened and was replaced by a growing sense of peace. Healing also meant grieving more than my mother. I grieved the relationship I thought I had, the future I imagined, and the version of myself who believed love required self-sacrifice without limit. Allowing myself to grieve those losses was essential because unacknowledged grief does not disappear, it transforms into resentment or numbness, and I did not want to carry either of those into the next chapter of my life. I sought support in ways I had not before. I spoke to people who listened without judgment, who held space without trying to fix me, and who reminded me of who I was beyond my pain, because healing is not meant to be done alone. And surrounding myself with compassion helped rewire the parts of me that had learned to expect dismissal and indifference. I learned that safe connection exists and that it feels different. It feels calm, consistent, and respectful. As I healed, I became more attentive to my inner voice, the one I had ignored for too long. That voice had been warning me for years through discomfort, unease, and small moments of hurt, and I had silenced it in the name of loyalty and hope. Listening to it now felt like reconnecting with an old friend, and it guided me toward choices that aligned with my values rather than my fears. Choosing myself did not mean acting out of anger, it meant acting out of clarity. Anger fades, but clarity endures, and clarity allowed me to make decisions that were thoughtful and intentional rather than reactive. I learned to pause, to reflect, and to ask myself whether a situation honored my dignity, and if the answer was no, I trusted myself enough to step away even when it was difficult. Healing also changed how I viewed my mother's legacy. Her death was not just an ending, it became a reminder of how she lived with self-respect, kindness, and strength, and honoring her memory meant living in a way that reflected those values. I realized that choosing myself was not a betrayal of my past, it was a continuation of the lessons she had instilled in me, even if I had forgotten them for a time. There were days when healing felt heavy, when old memories resurfaced and doubts crept in, but I learned that healing is not linear. Progress is not measured by the absence of pain but by the presence of self-compassion. On those days I spoke to myself gently. I reminded myself of how far I had come, and I resisted the urge to judge my own process, because judgment only deepens wounds while compassion allows them to close. As I became more grounded in myself, I noticed a shift in how others responded to me, not because they had changed but because I was no longer available for dismissiveness or ridicule, and that unavailability altered the dynamic. Sometimes it created distance and sometimes it invited respect. Either way, it protected my peace, and that became my priority. Choosing myself also meant embracing uncertainty. I did not have all the answers and I did not know exactly what the future would look like, but I trusted that any path built on self-respect would be more stable than one built on denial, and that trust gave me the courage to move forward one step at a time without needing a detailed map. Healing is an ongoing commitment, not a destination. It is the daily practice of honoring your feelings, maintaining your boundaries, and choosing actions that support your well-being. And I continue that practice even now, because the moment you stop choosing yourself, you risk losing yourself again, and I have learned the cost of that loss. In the end, healing began when I accepted that I could not change what had happened, but I could change how I responded to it. I could choose dignity over denial, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over silence, and those choices did not erase the pain, but they transformed it into wisdom and strength. And that is how healing truly begins, not with forgiveness or forgetting, but with the simple, powerful decision to stand on your own side and to live a life that reflects your worth every single day.